Welcome back, dear students. We are learning about the second chapter, banking institutions. In the current session 6, we're going to learn about public banks and private banks. The bank is the most trusted financial institution among the public. This institution fulfills all our financial needs. However, all banks are not the same. According to their stakeholders, a bank can be categorized into two categories, public sector banks and private sector banks. Coming to the meaning of public sector banks. A public sector bank is the one which has a major type of government owned banks in India, where a majority stake that is more than 50% is held by the Ministry of Finance of the Government of India or State Ministry of Finance of various state governments of India. The officers working for these entities and their subordinates are gazetted officers. The employees subordinate to the officers working for these respective entities and their subsidiaries are also full-fledged government employees. The shares of these banks are listed on stock exchanges. Their main objective is social welfare. Coming to the meaning of private sector banks. These are the banks in which the majority of the stake is held by shareholders of the bank and not by the government. RBL Bank, HDFC Bank, ICICI Bank, Yes Bank, etc. are the private sector banks in India. They provide all the banking products and services to the customers. Then speaking about the definition of a public sector bank. Public sector banks are the banks whose more than 50% shareholding lies with the central or state government. These banks are listed on stock exchange. In the Indian banking system, PSBs are the largest category of banks and emanated before independence. Then about definition of private sector bank. Banks whose greater part of the equity is held by private shareholders and entities rather than government is known as private sector banks. After most of the banks had not nationalized in the two streams, but those non-nationalized banks carried on their operations known as old generation private banks. Further, when the liberalization policy was coined in India, the banks which got a license like HDFC Bank, ICICI Bank, Axis Bank, etc., are considered as new generation private sector banks. Speaking about the key differences between the private sector banks and public sector banks. Public sector banks are the banks whose maximum shareholding is with the government. On the other hand, private sector banks are those whose maximum shareholding is with individuals and institutions. At present, there are 27 public sector banks in India, whereas there are only 22 private sector banks, which are under 4 local area private banks. Public sector banks dominate the Indian banking system by the total market share of 72.9%, which is followed by private sector banks by 19.7%. Public sector banks are established since long, while private sector banks emerged a few decades ago, and so the customer base of public sector banks is greater than the private ones. Transparency in terms of interest rate policies can be seen in the public sector. The interest rate on deposits offered by the public sector banks to its customers is slightly higher than the private sector banks. When it comes to promotion of employees, public sector banks consider seniority as a base. Conversely, merit is the basis of private sector banks to promote employees. Next, if we talk about the growth opportunities in a public sector banks, it is quite slow in comparison to a private sector banks. Next point, Job security is always present in a public sector bank, but private sector bank job is secured only when the performance is good, because performance is everything in a private sector. And lastly, along with job security, one more pro of a public sector bank is the after retirement benefit, that is pension. On the contrary, pension scheme is not provided by private sector banks to its employees. However, other retirement benefits like gratuity is offered by the bank. On concluding part, we can say every individual has certain priorities and one can easily choose between the two by scheduling down their preferences and going for the one that suits them best. Coming to the advantages of private sector banks. Some of the advantages that are associated with private sector banks are: private sector banks offer quick service to the customers. These banks also offer customized services according to the customer's financial needs. Private sector banks has a streamlined management system and quick financial decision making is possible in private sector banks. Then coming to the disadvantages of private sector banks. However, everything is not okay with private sector banks. These banks also lag in different areas. So, to speak about some of the disadvantages, private sector banks charge extra on every financial service. These banks only operate in cities and out of reach for the rural population. And private sector banks offers no job security to the employees. To conclude on this, we can say in any banking system, no bank, whether public or private, can survive unless it continuously strives to perform its organization into a self-governing, self-correcting and self-adjusting entity. For banks to grapple with these problems and manage the nature, structure and institutional rigidities need to be eased in two critical areas: comprehensive legal support for recovery of bad debts and a fundamental change in the pattern of governance for the public sector banks. While the public sector banks are in the process of restructuring, private sector banks are busy consolidating through mergers and acquisitions. That is, the sector has been recently opened up for foreign investments. So it can be concluded from the above that over the last 3 to 4 years, the asset quality has been at the lowest for Indian banks. Public sector banks have taken the biggest hit. The high exposure of public sector banks like SBI to corporate loans is one of the reasons for the stress on the asset quality. Thank you, dear students. We will meet again in the next session. Till then, take care. Bye bye.